Black Antlers at Noon. By David Hall. 23.04.2025. Chapter List. 1. Flesh like clay. 2. The crawling choir. 3. Wet ash and echoes. 4. Beneath the third rib. 5. He who holds the lantern. 6. Teeth in the bellows. 7. 13th step, no more. 8. Salt the marrow. 9. Where the trees remember you. 10. Don't blink in the fog. Summary: in a modern rural village slowly swallowed by ancient woodland, a decaying sanitarium known for unspeakable treatments is reopened for urban exploration. When 6 thrill seekers enter for a live stream, they disturb something older than the foundations and far more sentient than walls. As isolation, madness, and supernatural horrors mount, one by one they're claimed by the building, by each other, and by something wearing their skin. Reality bends. Time dislocates. Not everyone was supposed to leave, and some were never meant to enter. A tale thick with dread, hallucinations, gore, and creeping madness, Black Antlers at Noon is psychological horror soaked in blood and lies. Chapter 1, Flesh like clay. They called it the Holborn Institute for the Wretched, but everyone in Gressley just called it the Gut House. It squatted like a tumor at the edge of the woods, half devoured by vines, windows blackened by soot and time. Official records said it closed in 1973 after an electrical fire, but the locals whispered about locked wings, surgical laughter echoing at night, and that damn smell of coppery rot that never left the air. The story went that in the 50s, doctors worked here on the most extreme cases of mental illness, conducting experiments so secretive, so gruesome, that even the most hardened people in town wouldn't speak of it directly. There were rumors of lobotomies, unrecorded surgeries, and a massive underground chamber never found by authorities. No one dared go near the building except the thrill seekers, of course. Cam, Lexi, Jordan, Fiona, Reese, and Milo had no business being there. But when Cam pitched the idea for a Halloween live stream titled Real Terror, locked in an abandoned asylum for 72 hours, and the sponsors rolled in, they packed up their GoPros and took the long drive from London. They broke in just after noon, the air buzzing with flies and radio static. Christ, it stinks like someone boiled roadkill in bleach, Fiona gagged, pulling her scarf tighter around her face. She was the most pragmatic of the group, quick to scoff at superstition, but even her usual bravado faltered in the face of the pervasive stench that clung to the place like a bad memory. Her eyes darted nervously as she scanned the surroundings. She wasn't sure if it was the smell, the flickering light, or the silence, but something felt off. Reese, their designated cameraman, panned over the lobby. It was all rust-colored mold, collapsed ceiling beams, and doors that looked gnawed more than rotted. "Perfect," he whispered, entranced by the decay. His voice trembled slightly, betraying his excitement. He wasn't used to being so deep in an abandoned place like this, but the thought of what they might find kept his heart pounding. Milo, the skeptic of the group, muttered under his breath, "You'll all be crying by sundown. Place like this remembers who's afraid." His face twisted into an unsettling grin, and the others could feel the tension building, like the collective breath of the building itself. Milo was a cynic, but his words always seemed to strike a nerve, especially in places like this. "Who's afraid of an old building?" Cam asked, giving a forced laugh as he slapped the dust from his hands. He was the one who'd organized everything, the mastermind behind the plan, the one who would walk away with all the views and sponsors if things went well. "Besides, you saw the footage of the last group that came through here, right?" They left with a smile. Lexi, always the most vocal, glanced around, her eyes darting. "Yeah, they left all right, after spending hours trying to find a way out. This place feels like it's alive." The entrance hall had the distinct feeling of something that had been abandoned for too long. Paint peeled from the walls, hanging in strips like dead skin. The old tile floors were warped and cracked underfoot, each step echoing a little too loud, a little too hollow. Sunlight strained through broken blinds like prison bars. As they moved further in, they found themselves swallowed by shadows. Jordan, ever the tech geek, started fiddling with his equipment. He unzipped a large bag of gadgets. Night vision on standby. Signal strength scrap, but we'll buffer and upload later. You know, just in case we die, we'll have some evidence. Fiona rolled her eyes but pulled out a handheld EMF scanner. If we die, I'll haunt your ass for this. I swear. Reese moved to one of the hallway doors, which was stuck in place, its paint cracked and curling. This one's jammed. The moment he said it, something behind the door moved. Not loudly. Just a whisper of weight shifting. The group froze. Then a laugh, low, wet, and not human, rolled out from behind the peeling wood. Fiona dropped the EMF scanner. It clattered to the ground, sending a few sparks of static into the air. What the hell was that? Fiona breathed. She clutched her chest, heart thudding. Her voice was a whisper, a strange mix of disbelief and fear. It wasn't like anything they'd planned for in the script. Lexi looked to Cam. Was that you? Cam's face had drained of color. He shook his head slowly. No. Milo stepped forward, a smirk creeping onto his lips. Could be rats. Or a possum. Jordan was still trying to make sense of the sounds they just heard, his face twisting with confusion and curiosity. Possums don't laugh like they're choking on lungs. Milo approached the door, half daring, half dreading. Whatever it is, it's probably trapped behind a few boards. Could be nothing. The door didn't budge. But then there was something else. A subtle noise, the click of a knob turning. It was almost imperceptible. It turned just slightly. Once. Then back. Everyone stood still, waiting. Watching. No one spoke. Then the knob twisted once more. The door rattled against its frame, as though something or someone was trying to get out. Reese put his hand on his camera. All right, let's not do this. We came here to get views, not. Suddenly, the door was yanked open, but only enough to reveal a crack of shadow. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Jesus Christ! Fiona screamed, stepping backward. I'm done. But before anyone could respond, the hallway was filled with a chorus of whispers. Like 100 voices, barely audible, all talking over one another. And in that instant, the world seemed to shift. Everything seemed colder, darker, heavier. I need to see it, Reese muttered, his camera still rolling. Lexi grabbed his arm. No. Don't open it. But it was too late. There was a low, guttural hum almost like a warning, and the door swung open wider, faster. A shadow emerged, something tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally. Chapter 2, The Crawling Choir. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire building, making the air feel thick and heavy, as though it had absorbed every scream and desperate plea from years gone by. The world seemed to hold its breath, and for a long, suffocating second, no one moved. No one dared. Reese's camera had fallen to the ground, the lens pointed at nothing but the peeling walls and the darkness that began to press in from every angle. A dim light flickered above, casting erratic shadows that twisted and stretched unnaturally. In the corner of the frame, just beyond the camera's view, a sound like a deep, wet cough echoed through the hall. Did you hear that? Fiona asked, voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't hear anything, Milo replied, his tone sharp. He was the first to break the silence, his bravado returning in spades. Probably just the wind. Or the building settling. But it didn't sound like the building, Fiona insisted, her hands still trembling as she wiped away the sweat that had gathered on her brow. It was something else. The laughter, that dark, strangled sound, seemed to cling to the walls. It slithered through the cracks in the plaster, wrapping around their ears like a vine. A sound so wrong it made their stomachs churn, like something trying to speak, but failing, mimicking the guttural rasp of a human throat. Jordan took a step back, his eyes wide with unease. We need to get out of here. This isn't a joke anymore. This place isn't normal. Get a grip, Milo shot back. It's just some dumb sound effect or something. There's nothing here. Just abandoned crap. Cam, however, didn't speak. He stood frozen, staring at the door that had flung open of its own accord, the gap in the wood as wide as it had been when it had first been pulled. Something about it was off. Something that felt wrong, like the building had grown eyes. Or had opened them, finally, after all these years of sleep. Fiona stepped forward slowly, hesitantly, peering into the crack between the door and the dark corridor beyond. Her breath caught in her throat. There was something in the darkness, something moving. It was subtle at first, like a shifting shadow, but then the movement became undeniable. A long, impossibly thin arm stretched out, followed by the creak of bones cracking under strain. "Shut the damn door!" Reese shouted, his voice breaking as he rushed to grab the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as though something was pulling back from the other side, resisting his touch. Behind them, the air grew thick again, as if the very atmosphere of the place had changed, thickened with the weight of unseen eyes. It wasn't a draft anymore. The air was alive. It pressed in on them, crawling against their skin like something trying to claw its way under the surface. "What the hell is that?" Lexi gasped, pointing down the hallway. From the dark, something had started to emerge, shapes. Figures. They were indistinct at first, only faint outlines. But as they drew closer, they became clearer. Figures in ragged hospital gowns, their faces covered with tattered gauze or strips of cloth, dragging their limbs behind them with sickening slowness. They walked in a twisted, staggered procession, their movements jerky and disjointed, like marionettes with tangled strings. But it wasn't the disfigured people that struck fear into the group. It was the sound they made, an unnerving harmony of whispers that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. The sound wasn't like a chant or a hum, it was a series of wet, crawling noises, like fingers dragging through flesh, bones scraping against stone. There were no eyes to see, no mouths to form words. Yet, in the flickering light, the figures moved, slow but inexorable, like an unholy choir summoned by some ancient, unspeakable force. The sound was almost musical, but the notes were wrong. Each one scraped at their minds, each breath a cut deeper into their sanity. "Do you hear it?" Jordan whispered, his face pale. They're singing." Milo snorted in disbelief, but it came out weak. That's not real. It can't be. It's all part of the act. Just some stupid prank." But as he spoke, the whispering grew louder. The figures began to step closer, their movements becoming more deliberate, more coordinated. And still, that strange, scraping noise pulsed beneath it all, like the scrape of nails against a chalkboard, an agonized lullaby that twisted their stomachs. Why are they moving like that?" Fiona choked, eyes locked on the grotesque procession. It's like they're waiting for something." "Waiting for what?" Cam muttered, his throat dry. He glanced at the others, trying to mask the terror creeping into his voice. "Do we run? Or do we hide?" No one spoke for a moment. The decision didn't need to be made. The group was already moving, running in the only direction they could think to take down the hallway, further into the asylum. As they scrambled, Fiona stumbled, her foot catching on something unseen, and she fell hard to the ground. The camera jostled in Reese's hands as he swung it toward her. "Fiona!" But before he could reach her, something in the hallway shifted. The figures, those ragged shapes, were suddenly everywhere. They were blocking the way, stepping forward from every angle, cutting off every escape. One of the figures reached out with a twisted hand, its long fingers curling around Fiona's ankle. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the wet cacophony that surrounded them. The whispers rose to a crescendo. In their ears, in their minds. "Join us," it whispered. "Join us, or be forgotten." Chapter 3, Wet Ash and Echoes. Fiona's scream was cut short, swallowed by the oppressive air that hung thick with the whispers of the dead. Rhys's heart slammed in his chest as he grabbed her arm, pulling her with desperate strength, but the figure's grip was too strong. Fiona's face twisted in terror, her body stiffening under the touch of something inhuman, its fingers clawing into her ankle like roots digging into the earth. "Let her go," Milo shouted, his voice trembling. He raised his hands, unsure of what to do, the chaos around him too much to process. The figure did not respond. It only tilted its head, its featureless face wrapped in rags, as though it was considering something too grotesque to understand. Then, with an almost mechanical motion, it dragged Fiona toward the shadowed hallway beyond. "No. Get away from her!" Rhys bellowed, his breath ragged. Without thinking, he lunged, grabbing at Fiona's other arm. His fingers slipped against the slick, clammy texture of her skin as though it were something unnatural, something that did not belong in this world. But the pull was too strong, and the ragged figure jerked Fiona out of his reach. In the seconds that felt like hours, a flood of adrenaline surged through Rhys's veins. He dove forward again, this time toward the ground beneath them. But before his hands could touch the cold stone floor, the ground itself seemed to buckle, as though it were shifting beneath him. A sudden shock of dizziness hit him, and for a moment, he lost his balance. Fiona's face was now a mask of horror as she struggled in vain against the unyielding grip of the figure, her eyes wide with desperation. But that scream, the one that had pierced the air moments before, had grown quieter. Fainter. Almost as though it were being silenced by something far beyond their comprehension. "What the hell is this?" Cam yelled, stepping back as if the very presence of the figures was enough to repel him. He fumbled for his phone, but his hands were shaking too violently to get a decent grip. "Get your damn cameras working." The air around them grew colder, thick with a damp, foul stench that crawled into their lungs and made them gag. The smell of rot and decay swirled, filling every breath with a taste of the grave. It was as if the building itself were alive, breathing, exhaling something far darker than any of them could fathom. "Rhys." Lexi's voice cut through the panic, her words sharp and frantic. She grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the group. "We have to leave. Now. This place, this thing, it's not just haunted. It's alive. Alive." The word echoed in Rhys's mind as he watched Fiona being dragged away into the darkness. His body stiffened, his heart a pounding drum in his chest, but the figures still stood in their way, motionless but blocking every path of escape. The crawling choir, the grotesque procession of the damned, slowly advanced. Their haunting presence filled the hallway with an air of inevitability. "Where do we go?" Jordan asked, his voice breaking as he darted his eyes around in a panic, looking for an exit. But no exit presented itself. The doors were shut, locked, and there were no windows. Only the black corridor stretching ahead. "Downstairs," Cam muttered, half to himself. His eyes flickered toward the staircase at the end of the hallway, where darkness seemed to pool, swirling like ink. "There has to be something down there. We can." But the words died in his throat. A low, resonant hum had begun to grow louder in the distance. It reverberated through the walls, rattling their bones with each passing second. The hum seemed to come from everywhere, an unseen presence that pushed against the very air itself, as though it were something ancient, an entity of pure force moving toward them. The figures in the hallway stirred, their movement smooth and eerie, as if they were all drawn to the source of the sound. The tension thickened, wrapping around them like a noose. Reese swallowed hard. There was no turning back now. They were stuck. Trapped. With nowhere to run and no way to escape. As the figures moved closer, a pair of glowing eyes appeared in the pitch-black darkness of the hallway. They gleamed like distant stars, and in that moment, Reese felt as if the entire building was watching them, listening to every breath they took. The eyes blinked, slowly, as though studying them. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them trembled. The darkness seemed to grow deeper, darker, and colder. It was then that they heard the voice. Not a sound in the air, not a whisper, but something much more personal. Something that crawled directly into their minds. It was the voice of the building itself, the voice of the darkness they had stumbled upon. You should never have come here. Reese's blood ran cold. Now you belong to us. With that final, chilling utterance, the figures began to advance, their broken limbs and haunting movements drawing ever closer. Reese stumbled backward, his legs weak with fear. He had to act. He had to do something. He was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. But that voice, it was real. The figures were real. Fiona was still out there. Run. Reese screamed, his words barely escaping his throat. He grabbed Lexi, pulling her toward the staircase. But it was too late. The procession had already begun. It was as if the building itself had opened its mouth, and the crawling choir, the grotesque souls that had once been trapped inside, had come to claim what was rightfully theirs. Reese glanced back for just a moment, his heart twisting. Fiona's screams were distant now, fading into the horrific hum of the building's breath. Then, in the blink of an eye, everything went black. Chapter 4, Through the Hollow Flesh. Reese's world had become a blur of shadows and noise. His heart raced in his chest as he gripped Lexi's hand, pulling her down the dark stairwell, deeper into the bowels of the house. The heavy thud of their footsteps reverberated against the cold, unforgiving stone, echoing through the stairwell like the sound of a distant drum beat. The air was suffocating, thick with something rotten, as though the building itself was exhaling the stench of death. Fiona. We have to find Fiona. Reese gasped, his voice ragged from the panic that gripped him. Lexi's hand tightened around his as they descended further. She didn't speak, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. It felt like they were being pulled into the very heart of the house, down into its ancient, decaying innards. But the further they went, the quieter it became. The oppressive hum, the eerie whispers that had filled the air moments ago, seemed to fade into the distance, swallowed by the choking darkness. They reached the bottom of the stairs, a heavy door blocking their path. The door was old, its wood warped and cracked with age, the handle rusted beyond recognition. Reese shoved his shoulder into it, forcing it open. The creak of the hinges echoed down the corridor beyond, a sound far too loud for the suffocating silence of the house. Inside was worse. The room was vast, its high, vaulted ceilings disappearing into the blackness above. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, slick with moisture, slick with something darker. It was as though the building itself was breathing, its flesh alive and writhing. The floor was uneven, cracked in places, and covered in an unidentifiable black substance that clung to their boots like tar. This is wrong, Lexi whispered, her voice barely audible. She was trembling, her eyes darting nervously from corner to corner. Where are we? This place, it's not normal. Reese didn't respond. He couldn't. His mind was too consumed by the image of Fiona being dragged into the darkness, her cries for help still echoing in his ears. He had to find her. Had to. Fiona. Reese yelled into the oppressive silence, his voice cracking. But there was no answer. Only the hum of the house, louder now, vibrating in the walls, in the floor beneath their feet. It was the sound of something ancient, something hungry. Reese's skin crawled as the sensation of being watched intensified. Lexi glanced nervously toward the far corner of the room, her face growing even paler. Her eyes locked on something, and for a brief moment, Reese thought he saw something move in the shadows, something not quite human, a silhouette that shifted too quickly to be natural. "Did you see that?" Lexi whispered. Reese turned sharply, his heart racing. "Where? What?" But the shadow was gone, swallowed by the darkness, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. "Stay close," he muttered, barely able to keep the tremor out of his voice. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the flickering shadows. They continued deeper into the room, moving toward what appeared to be a large, ornate archway at the far end. The air grew colder with each step, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Reese could see his breath, misting in front of his face. They reached the archway, and Reese paused, his heart hammering in his chest. The air here felt wrong. It was as though something beyond the arch was pulling at him, something dark, something ancient. His hand reached for the stone beside the archway, and as his fingers brushed it, a jolt of cold shot up his arm. "Reese," Lexi began, but her voice faltered. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. A low growl rumbled from the depths of the house, like the growl of a beast waking from a long slumber. The walls seemed to close in, pressing on them from all sides. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, lengthening like fingers, reaching for them, pulling them into the dark. "Get back!" Reese shouted, yanking Lexi away from the archway. But it was too late. The door they had just passed through slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang, trapping them inside. Reese spun, his breath catching in his throat. They were surrounded, the darkness closing in like a living thing, coiling around them, suffocating them. Lexi staggered backward, her hand flying to her mouth in terror. "Reese, look," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of 100 fears. Reese followed her gaze. What he saw made his blood run cold. From the depths of the room, a figure began to emerge. Tall and gaunt, its form twisted, its movements unnatural. It had no face, only a gaping, hollow void where its features should have been. It was clad in tattered robes that seemed to move, flowing like smoke, and its arms were stretched out long, thin as skeletal branches. It was like a shadow that had taken on substance, a darkness that had come alive. The figure floated forward, moving impossibly fast despite its slow, graceful gestures. Its feet didn't touch the ground, hovering just above it as it approached. "You should never have come here." The voice came, deep and resonant, filling the room with its terrible weight. It was not a voice, not a sound, but something deeper, something that seemed to crawl directly into Reese's mind. "You belong to me now." Reese stepped back, his pulse thundering in his ears. The shadows moved with the figure, twisting and warping, folding into one another, taking shape, taking form. They were no longer just shadows. They were something else. Something worse. "Fiona!" Reese shouted, his voice cracking. "Where is she?" But the figure did not respond. It only raised a hand, its fingers long and unnaturally thin. The temperature dropped further. Reese could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on him, suffocating him. The walls seemed to warp around him, as if the room itself was alive, shifting, pulsating. "Fiona!" Reese screamed again, his voice hoarse. "Answer me. Where is she?" There was a long pause. Then the figure spoke once more, its words thick with malice. "She is where you cannot reach her. You are too weak to save her." Reese's breath hitched. What do you want?" "Your souls. All of you. You will become part of me. Forever." A sickening silence followed, and then the figure moved. It stretched its arms toward them, and the shadows surged forward, swallowing Reese and Lexi whole. Chapter 5, The silent feast. Rhys's body went cold as the shadows enveloped him. The darkness rushed in from every side, wrapping around him like an invisible vice, squeezing, pulling, suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, but the sound was drowned out by a louder, more insidious noise, the sound of something scraping, gnawing, tearing at the fabric of his reality. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The shadows clung to him, seeping into his skin, flooding his senses with the coldest void imaginable. His thoughts became scattered, splintered, as if something was eating away at the edges of his mind, chewing through his consciousness. A whisper, low and guttural, slithered through his ears. "You will join the feast. You will join us." Rhys's eyes shot open. He hadn't realized he had closed them. The blackness before him had faded, replaced with the dim glow of candles flickering in a vast, circular chamber. The room stretched out impossibly far in all directions, the walls covered in ancient carvings that twisted and writhed like living things. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something far worse than death. The thing was gone. But its presence lingered, suffocating the room with its oppressive weight. Lexi was beside him, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Rhys wanted to say something, anything, to comfort her, but no words came. His throat was dry, tight with fear. In front of them, at the far end of the room, a long, wooden table stretched out, covered in strange, blackened dishes that exuded a putrid stench. The table was lined with seats, but the chairs were not empty. Figures sat around it, figures twisted and malformed, their skin pale and mottled, their eyes glowing with an unholy light. They were not human. The figures' faces were gaunt, their features twisted into grotesque caricatures of life. Some had long, clawed hands, others had mouths too wide for their faces, jagged teeth protruding like shards of broken glass. They stared at Rhys and Lexi with eyes full of hunger, as though they had been waiting for them. Rhys took a step back, his foot catching on the cold, stone floor. His breath caught in his throat. What are they?" Lexi's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Monsters. They're monsters, Rhys. All of them." The figures around the table began to move. They made no noise, no sound, as though they were part of the very shadows themselves. One of them, the tallest, with an elongated neck and a mouth that seemed to split its face in half, rose slowly from its seat. Its eyes locked onto Rhys's, and for a moment, Rhys could have sworn he saw a twisted, grotesque smile crawl across the creature's face. "You've come to partake, yes." The voice was thick with malice, a low rumbling that vibrated through Rhys's chest. "You've come to join us in the feast." Rhys's stomach turned. He couldn't speak. His mouth felt dry, his mind too clouded by fear to process the situation. The creature leaned forward, its long, clawed fingers brushing against the table, leaving behind trails of black, viscous liquid. "The Feast of Souls," it continued, its voice dripping with twisted pleasure. "A never-ending banquet of agony and despair. And now, you are part of it." A loud clattering noise interrupted the creature's speech, and Rhys's heart skipped a beat. One of the smaller figures, hunched over, had risen from its seat, dragging a dark, metal tray behind it. The tray was filled with writhing things that Rhys could not make out, but they stank of rot and decay. The figure slid the tray across the table, and it stopped in front of one of the others. The figure on the far end of the table reached for it, its clawed hands moving with unsettling speed. Rhys gagged. His stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. The figure on the end of the table pulled something from the tray, something that didn't look like food. It was a human hand, shriveled and blackened, the flesh slick with some oily substance. The figure held it to its mouth, and with a grotesque, wet sound, it tore into the meat. Rhys stumbled backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wanted to scream, to run, but his legs felt like jelly, and every direction seemed just as hopeless as the last. "Please, please," Lexi whispered beside him, her voice cracking. This can't be real. This can't be happening." But the creatures continued to eat. The room echoed with wet, sickening sounds, chewing, slurping, tearing like a feast of the damned. They tore into their meal, gnashing their teeth, gorging themselves on what seemed to be pieces of flesh, of bone, of something that had once been human. Reese turned his head away, his eyes closed tight, but no matter how hard he tried to shut it out, the sounds kept coming. The stench of decay filled his nostrils. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him, suffocating him. His mind was breaking, his grip on reality slipping with each second. The tall figure that had first spoken rose again from its seat. Its elongated, crooked limbs twisted unnaturally as it moved toward them, its glowing eyes never leaving Reese. "You were never meant to leave," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "This is your fate now. Your souls will be consumed, just like the others. Just like her. Fiona." Reese breathed, his throat closing up. "Where is she? Where is Fiona?" The creature's eyes flashed, its smile widening. "She is already ours. The feast has already begun." Before Reese could react, the creature reached forward with its clawed hands, grasping for him. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out beneath him. He felt the cold, slick surface of the stone floor against his skin, but there was no escape. The creature was too fast, too strong. A flash of light, a brilliant, blinding light exploded in the center of the room, and the creatures recoiled, screeching in pain. Reese looked up, and for the briefest of moments, he saw a figure in the center of the light, a tall, cloaked figure, wielding a sword of pure light. "You will not take them," the figure shouted, its voice deep, commanding. "Not while I still stand." The creatures hissed, their forms recoiling from the light, but the tall figure stood strong, its weapon raised high, cutting through the darkness. And then the room exploded into chaos. Chapter 6, The Price of Freedom. The room trembled as the cloaked figure moved, its blade of light cutting through the air with the power of a storm. The creatures around the table screeched in fury, their bodies contorting in unnatural ways as they recoiled from the blinding light. But the figure didn't relent. Its movements were swift, each swing of its blade sending ripples of searing brilliance through the darkness. Reese couldn't tear his eyes away. He watched, frozen, as the cloaked figure slashed through one of the monstrous beings, its blade cleaving the creature in two with a sickening crack. The figure moved with a precision that seemed impossible, as if the very fabric of reality bent around it. The light it wielded was pure, unrelenting, a beacon in the oppressive dark. But even as one creature fell, more surged forward to take its place. Their twisted forms flitted through the shadows like phantoms, moving faster than Reese could comprehend. One of them lunged toward the cloaked figure with inhuman speed, but the figure turned just in time, the blade of light slicing clean through its torso. It disintegrated with a hiss, leaving behind nothing but a foul-smelling residue in the air. The figure's voice rang out again, deep and commanding. "Run. Now." Reese snapped out of his daze, the command piercing through the fog of fear in his mind. He grabbed Lexi by the arm, pulling her toward the nearest exit, but the path was blocked by the rising tide of grotesque beings. They hissed and writhed, their eyes glowing with an insatiable hunger as they closed in, their mouths salivating in anticipation. "No!" Reese shouted, panic setting in as he realized the room was closing in on them. He tried to force his legs to move faster, but the weight of the air, thick with dread, pressed down on him like an iron shackle. The cloaked figure moved again, cutting down a half-dozen creatures in a single, fluid motion. But there were too many. They kept coming. Every time one fell, two more appeared in its place. The creatures' bodies shifted and reformed, their forms blending with the darkness, as though they were born from it. "Lexi!" Reese cried out, his voice rising in panic. "We have to get out of here." But Lexi was frozen, her wide eyes reflecting the chaos unfolding around them. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We can't. We can't fight them. We'll never make it out alive." Reese's grip on her tightened. "We have to try." He looked around, desperate, trying to find any sign of escape. And then, his eyes fell on the far wall of the room. There, hidden in the shadows, was an archway, an exit of sorts, though it was barely visible against the overwhelming blackness. Without thinking, he pulled Lexi toward it, shoving aside any creatures that came too close, the adrenaline in his veins burning hot. The monsters shrieked, their hunger growing louder, but they couldn't reach them fast enough. He and Lexi managed to squeeze through the archway, tumbling into a narrow corridor that twisted and spiraled in the dark. They didn't stop running. Reese could hear the creatures behind them, their claws scraping along the stone, their footsteps growing closer with each passing second. The corridor seemed to stretch forever, winding deeper into the bowels of the unseen structure. Just as Reese thought they might be safe, the floor beneath them shifted, trembling violently. He barely had time to react as the ceiling above them began to crack and splinter. Dark, bony hands reached down from above, their nails sharp as daggers. With a terrified scream, Reese yanked Lexi back, just as the ceiling above collapsed in a heap of rubble, trapping them in a claustrophobic pocket of space. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, ragged, frantic, and then, the ground beneath them gave way. They fell into darkness. Underscore 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 on. When Reese's senses returned, he found himself lying on cold stone, the smell of rot and decay thick in the air. He groaned and pushed himself up, blinking against the dim, flickering light. The corridor had disappeared, replaced with a massive cavernous space, ancient, silent, and far too vast to comprehend. The ground around them was covered in strange symbols and markings, glowing faintly in the dim light. "Where are we?" Lexi's voice trembled as she sat up beside him, her eyes wide with fear. Reese didn't have an answer. His chest was tight with unease, his mind racing to understand what had just happened. They had fallen, but where? And why did it feel like they had just entered another world altogether? The ground trembled again, but this time, it wasn't the ceiling about to collapse. No, this was something much deeper, something much older. Reese could feel the tremor in the very air around them, vibrating through his bones. Lexi grabbed his arm, her grip tight. "Reese, we have to get out of here. This place, it feels wrong. It's like it's alive." Before he could respond, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the cavern, sending chills down Reese's spine. From the shadows ahead, two glowing eyes appeared, slowly at first, then growing brighter and brighter. The eyes were massive, too large to be human, and they were locked directly onto him. A voice, dark and ancient, rumbled from the shadows. "You have trespassed into the domain of the elders. You will pay the price for your insolence." The air thickened, pressing in on them as the growl grew louder, its source slowly emerging from the depths of the cavern. Something monstrous, something older than the earth itself, was coming for them. And it had no intention of letting them leave alive. Chapter 7, The Awakening. The dark shape that had emerged from the shadows was like nothing Reese had ever seen. Towering and grotesque, its form seemed to shift between dimensions, flickering and distorting, as though it existed outside the realm of normality. Its eyes, two glowing orbs, were the only constant in the blackness of the cavern, and they fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Lexi clung to his side, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow with fear. Reese could feel the weight of her terror pressing against him like a physical force, but he knew he had no choice but to keep moving forward. There was no time to process the enormity of what they were facing. Survival, pure and simple, was all that mattered now. The voice echoed in the cavern again, its deep tones vibrating through the stone floor beneath them. You have disturbed the Elder's domain. You will die here, in the darkness. Rhys's heart pounded in his chest, a drumbeat of impending doom. The being before them was ancient, its voice laced with the weight of countless years, but he couldn't give in to fear. Not now. Not when they were so close to whatever lay beyond the horrors they had just endured. What do you want from us? Rhys shouted into the abyss, his voice breaking the silence that had held the cavern in its thrall. The creature's eyes glowed brighter, its form growing even more distorted. You trespass on sacred ground. You seek to escape, but escape is a lie, it rasped. The air around them thickened, turning oppressive as the being stepped forward, its massive limbs causing the ground to shake with each movement. You are already lost. Before Rhys could respond, the creature raised one of its enormous claws, its talons sharp enough to tear through metal. With a swift, fluid motion, it slashed the air, sending a shockwave of force through the cavern. The walls trembled violently, and the ground cracked beneath their feet, throwing Rhys and Lexi off balance. They tumbled to the ground, their bodies crashing against the jagged stones. Pain shot through Rhys's side, but he gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, his hand instinctively reaching for Lexi, pulling her close. He couldn't let her fall. Not now. The creature's growl reverberated around them like 1,000 storms colliding. You cannot escape the Elder's wrath. There is no place for you here. Rhys's mind raced, desperate for a solution, but he found none. They were trapped in a cavern with an ancient, unknowable being that spoke in riddles and threats. Whatever had brought them to this place, whatever force had opened the doorway, seemed to be fading, leaving them alone in the dark with no way out. Suddenly, a flash of light appeared in the distance, flickering through the shadows like a beacon in the night. Rhys's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the cloaked figure from before? The one that had saved them in the chamber? Without thinking, Rhys grabbed Lexi's arm, pulling her toward the light. They stumbled through the cavern, their legs unsteady as they moved toward the glowing aura. The air grew heavier with each step, pressing down on them as if the very weight of the darkness sought to crush them into submission. But they couldn't stop. Not now. The creature behind them roared, its voice laced with fury. You cannot escape. This is where you will die. The ground trembled again, more violently this time, and Rhys barely kept his footing. He could feel the darkness closing in around them, its cold fingers reaching for them, threatening to drag them back into the abyss. Keep moving. Lexi cried, her voice filled with desperation. We have to get to the light. They pushed forward, ignoring the pain in their limbs, ignoring the sense of impending doom that gnawed at their souls. The light ahead seemed to grow closer, its warmth offering a brief respite from the crushing darkness, but the path was never easy. The creature's roars echoed louder, more insistent, as it pursued them with relentless fury. Rhys glanced over his shoulder, his stomach twisting in terror. The being was gaining on them, its massive form blocking out the last of the light from the cavern as it moved closer, faster than anything of its size should be able to. Just as Rhys thought they might be caught, they reached the light. They surged forward, their hands outstretched, the warmth of the glow wrapping around them like a shield. But it wasn't the end. The moment they stepped into the light, the cavern seemed to shudder, and the ground beneath them cracked open. A roaring wind filled the space, and the cavern walls began to collapse, large chunks of stone falling like rain. The creature's growl shifted into an anguished scream, the sound of something ancient and wrong, as if it were being torn apart by forces beyond comprehension. Rhys and Lexi didn't wait to see what happened next. They dashed into the light, their bodies merging with the radiance, their minds filled with the hope that it would lead them somewhere, anywhere away from the horrors they had witnessed. As the world around them spun into chaos, they were consumed by the light. Chapter 8, The Betrayal. The light enveloped them, soothing the raw nerves in their bodies, the burning fatigue of their escape momentarily forgotten as it cradled them like a mother's embrace. It was a false comfort, though, and they both knew it. The darkness was never far behind. Not when they had disturbed whatever ancient forces had been slumbering beneath their feet. Rhys stumbled forward, his head spinning, struggling to stay grounded. His breath came in ragged gasps, and the dull pain in his side flared up with each step. Lexi was beside him, her pale face lit by the warm glow, but even she seemed uncertain. Her eyes, wide with fear, scanned their surroundings, but there was nothing in the light except, nothing. "What is this place?" Rhys muttered, his voice hoarse. Lexi didn't answer immediately. She had her own thoughts, her own suspicions, but none of them were comforting. The light had come from nowhere, had appeared as if summoned by some unseen hand, and now they stood in a space that felt just as much like a prison as the dark cavern they had fled. The air here was thicker, filled with the heavy scent of ozone, a smell that clung to the skin and made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. "I don't know," Lexi whispered, her voice trembling. "But I don't think we're safe here either." Rhys's gaze flickered around the space, hoping for some sign of escape, but the longer he looked, the more he felt a deep sense of dread settling in his stomach. The light had no source. It just existed. And the air, now still, seemed too quiet, unnervingly so. It was as though the world had stopped moving, holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. And then, as if on cue, it happened. A shape materialized before them, flickering in and out of existence, a silhouette too familiar to be trusted. Rhys froze, his breath catching in his throat. "No," he breathed, his heart plummeting into his stomach. "No, it can't be." Before them stood the cloaked figure that had helped them earlier, the one that had guided them through the labyrinthine tunnels and, for all intents and purposes, had been their savior. But this time, it was different. This time, the figure stood still, its form dark and menacing, the edges of its cloak curling inward like smoke. Its face was hidden beneath the hood, but Rhys could feel the weight of its gaze, as though it was looking straight through him. "Rhys." The voice came, but it was colder now, distant, as if it were no longer the same person who had spoken before. The timbre was hollow, an empty echo that sent a chill running down his spine. "Lexi, listen to me," the figure continued, its voice like a shiver through the bones. "I've tried to protect you both, but there are forces at work here that none of us can control." Rhys took a step back, eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" His words trembled on the edge of disbelief. "You're the one who brought us here, aren't you?" The figure's laugh was hollow, bitter, and without warmth. "I didn't bring you here," it said softly. "But I can't keep you safe either. Not from this." Rhys's mind raced, confusion clouding his thoughts. He had so many questions, so many things that didn't make sense. And now, as the figure stood before him, his heart filled with a deep, gnawing suspicion. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Why don't you just tell us what's going on?" Lexi's voice cracked, breaking through the thick tension in the air. "What is it you're hiding from us?" The figure hesitated, then slowly, almost reluctantly, lifted its hand, its long fingers stretching toward them like claws. "The truth is this," it said, its voice taking on a darker edge. "The moment you crossed into this place, you sealed your fate. You are no longer just part of the game. You are the game." The words hit Rhys like a blow to the gut. His knees threatened to give way, but he forced himself to stand, to remain upright. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice was stronger now, fueled by the rising panic within him. The figure tilted its head, and Rhys could see the flicker of something beneath the hood, a brief flash of light or maybe a shadow. Whatever it was gone before he could truly comprehend it. "You've been manipulated," the figure whispered, its voice now almost mournful. You and Lexi both. You think you've been running from the creatures and the darkness, but in truth, you've been running right into it. Reese felt his blood run cold. No, no. This isn't possible. You helped us. You saved us. A twisted smile played across the figure's lips. I did save you. But only because you have something I need. And now, I'm taking it. Before Reese could respond, the figure raised its hands, and the air around them began to vibrate with a low, humming energy. Lexi gasped, stepping back in shock. The ground beneath their feet shifted as though the earth itself were being torn apart. No. Reese shouted, his instincts screaming at him to move, to fight back. But it was too late. The cloaked figure's hands shot out, and the world around them twisted and spiraled, reality itself cracking and splintering like fragile glass. Goodbye, Reese, the figure whispered, its voice echoing through the vortex that now surrounded them. And then, everything went black. Chapter 9, The Reckoning. The darkness was suffocating. For a brief moment, Reese thought he was dead. The world had shifted so violently, so suddenly, that his senses failed him. He was weightless, floating in an abyss that pressed against his skin like 1,000 invisible hands, tugging and pulling him in every direction at once. His thoughts scattered, slipping through his mind like water through a cracked vessel. But then, there was a sharp pain, a jolt in his chest that sent a shock of panic through him. His lungs burned, and he gasped for air, trying to cling to something solid, anything to anchor him to the world. His hands flailed, and the darkness rippled around him like oil on water. Reese. The voice cut through the silence, a whisper that seemed to slice through the blackness with an edge of familiarity. It was Lexi's voice. Reese's heart slammed against his ribs. He tried to call out to her, but his mouth was dry, his tongue thick. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. Reese, she shouted again, her voice more frantic now, closer. Her voice was the only thing that anchored him, the only sound in the suffocating void that gave him something to latch onto. Suddenly, a flash of light pierced the darkness, blinding him momentarily. His body jerked as though pulled by an unseen force, and he was slammed back into his own skin with a brutal force that left him gasping for breath. His vision swam, and he squinted against the light. Lexi was standing in front of him, her face twisted in fear. She reached out, her fingers brushing his arm, grounding him in the chaos. "Are you okay?" she asked breathlessly, her voice trembling with both relief and terror. Reese nodded, though the words caught in his throat. The light around them flickered, revealing that they were no longer in the same place. Gone was the ethereal glow that had surrounded them, replaced by a cold, unforgiving expanse. The ground beneath their feet was cracked, as though some great force had torn it apart, leaving jagged edges and deep crevices. The air was thick with the smell of burnt metal and decay, and the distant echoes of something monstrous reverberated through the desolate space. It was as though they had been dropped into the very heart of hell itself. What happened? Lexi whispered, her eyes darting nervously around the barren landscape. Where are we? Reese swallowed hard, trying to make sense of the scene. The figure, whoever or whatever it had been, had disappeared, leaving them in this nightmarish place. His pulse throbbed in his temples as the reality of their situation began to settle in. "We've been trapped," he muttered, though it didn't feel real. "Whatever this is, it's not over. We're not safe here." His eyes scanned the horizon, but there was no sign of life, no sign of anything that could offer them hope. Just more twisted earth and the haunting whisper of the wind. It was as though they were suspended in an endless void, cut off from everything they knew. And then, there was a sound, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a horrible sense of dread washed over them. Lexi stiffened beside him, her hand instinctively grasping his arm. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Reese's eyes narrowed, but he couldn't make out the source of the noise. It was close now, growing louder, the sound vibrating in his bones. His muscles tensed, and he could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, preparing for whatever was to come. "Stay close," he said, his voice low and steady. "We don't know what's out there." Without warning, the ground beneath them cracked open with a deafening roar, and a massive, grotesque shape emerged from the depths. It was like nothing Reese had ever seen, a creature of shifting darkness, its form constantly changing, rippling with tendrils and spindly limbs. Its eyes, or what he could only assume were eyes, glowed a sickly yellow, fixed on them with a malevolent hunger. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, teeth-like formations, each one sharper than the last. It lunged at them, its screeching howl reverberating through the air like a banshee's wail. Reese didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lexi by the wrist, yanking her to the side just as the creature's claws swiped through the air, missing them by mere inches. They stumbled, nearly losing their balance, but Reese managed to keep his footing. They ran. Their feet pounded against the fractured ground, each step more desperate than the last. Lexi's breath was ragged beside him, and Reese's heart pounded in his chest. The creature's growls grew louder as it pursued them, its monstrous form closing in with terrifying speed. "We can't outrun it," Lexi gasped. "We have to. Keep running," Reese snapped, not daring to look back. The ground beneath them buckled again, and this time, Reese couldn't stop himself from looking over his shoulder. The creature was right behind them, too close. It surged forward, its clawed hand reaching for Lexi. Time seemed to slow. Without thinking, Reese spun around, his body moving on pure instinct. He grabbed a jagged rock from the ground and hurled it at the creature with all his strength. The rock struck its face with a sickening thud, and the creature shrieked in pain, momentarily thrown off course. But it wasn't enough. It wasn't even close. The creature roared in fury and lashed out, its claws slashing through the air with lethal precision. Reese's heart skipped a beat as one of the claws grazed his shoulder, tearing through his flesh with a sickening rip. Pain exploded in his side, and he stumbled, nearly falling to the ground. But Lexi was still beside him, still running. "Keep going," Reese forced out through clenched teeth. "We have to get out of here." The creature was relentless, but so were they. The landscape shifted again, but this time, Reese didn't care where it led. As long as it wasn't here, away from the creature, away from the horror that had chased them into this hell. They ran together, faster now, pushing themselves beyond their limits, even as their bodies screamed in protest. And in the distance, Reese saw something. A flicker of light. Just a glimmer, but it was there. "Lexi," he shouted, his voice raw with urgency. "This way." They turned toward the light, praying it was their salvation. But even as they raced toward it, the creature's growl echoed behind them, reminding them that they weren't out of danger yet. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Chapter 10, The Final Hour. The light ahead grew brighter as Reese and Lexi ran, their feet pounding against the fractured earth. The creature's growls had become an incessant, gnawing sound in their ears, echoing with the promise of their imminent death. Every muscle in Reese's body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He couldn't stop now. Not with the light just within reach. Not with Lexi beside him, her hand gripping his tightly as if she too were willing herself to escape. "Faster!" Reese barked, his breath ragged, the words barely escaping through his gritted teeth. Lexi didn't hesitate. She pushed herself harder, faster, though the exhaustion was apparent in her strained movements. They were both bleeding now, their bodies battered and bruised from their flight. The creature was still gaining on them, its monstrous form a black blur in the corner of Reese's vision. Its shrieking howl vibrated through the air, shaking the ground beneath them. It was gaining. The light, though still distant, beckoned them with an irresistible pull. It flickered like a dying star, yet somehow, It promised salvation. They couldn't afford to doubt it. Not now. With one final surge of energy, Reese pushed forward, dragging Lexi along behind him. His legs felt like lead, his side throbbing with the deep, burning ache of his wounds, but he kept going. They had to reach the light. The ground around them shifted once more, a sharp tremor running through the earth. Reese's foot caught on something, and he stumbled, almost falling face first into the dirt. He managed to catch himself, but his momentum faltered. The creature roared, its claws scraping against the ground, an agonizing sound that seemed to freeze time. No! Lexi screamed, her voice full of terror. We can't stop. Reese forced his legs to move again, pushing himself forward with every ounce of strength he had left. He could see it now, the light was real. It wasn't an illusion, a trick of the darkness. It was a doorway, a shimmering rift that pulsed with an otherworldly glow. Beyond it was something familiar, something he hadn't dared hope for, a glimpse of their world, of the place they had come from. A place of safety. A place of sanity. But the creature was still behind them, too close. Reese could hear its breathing now, wet and labored, like some great animal tracking its prey. He didn't dare look back again, but he could feel the presence of it. It was there. Closing in. Lexi, jump! Reese shouted, his voice raw with desperation. She didn't hesitate. She leapt forward, her body crashing through the rift, disappearing into the glowing void beyond. Reese reached the threshold just behind her, but as his foot made contact with the light, a sharp, bone-crushing pain tore through his chest. The creature had caught him. Its claws sank into his flesh, ripping through his ribs like paper, pulling him back into the darkness. The light flickered, wavering, as if it were responding to his pain, to the violence of the struggle. Lexi, he screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the creature's terrible shriek. His vision began to fade, the edges of his sight blurring into blackness. His heart hammered in his chest, and the pain was unbearable, a fire that consumed him from the inside out. He could feel the rift, he could feel the light pulling him away, but the creature's grip tightened, dragging him back. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. It was as if the world itself was breaking apart around him, pieces of reality collapsing into nothing. And then, with a final, heart-wrenching roar, the creature let him go. Reese was thrown through the rift, his body hurtling into the light. He hit the ground hard, his vision spinning, but he was alive. He had made it. Lexi was already on her feet, her eyes wide with horror as she stared back toward the rift. Reese could barely see her through the haze of his pain, but he managed to crawl toward her, his hands trembling as he reached out. Lexi! He whispered, his voice barely audible, we made it. She didn't answer at first. She was still staring at the rift, her face pale with shock. Then, slowly, she turned to him, her eyes filled with a kind of grim understanding. We're not safe yet, she said quietly, her voice shaking. Reese's heart lurched. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He knew. The rift behind them was closing, but the world around them was not the one they had left. This was a world they had never seen before, a landscape twisted and unfamiliar, its colors wrong. The sky was a sickly green, and the ground was covered in jagged, black rock that stretched endlessly in every direction. There was no sun, no stars, no sign of life. It was a dead world, a place outside of time and space, a prison that neither of them had chosen. The rift slammed shut with an awful, grinding noise, and the oppressive silence of the place settled in around them. Reese could feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread, as if they had just walked into a trap, into something much worse than they could have ever imagined. He wanted to ask Lexi what she meant, what she thought was still coming for them, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he turned to face the new nightmare ahead, unsure whether their fight was truly over. They were alone in the darkness now, and nothing would be the same again. The end.